February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima, Pacific Ocean. The black volcanic sands burned beneath the boots of thousands of U.S. Marines as they charged into hell itself. The air was thick with sulfur, smoke, and the scream of Japanese machine guns hidden deep within Mount Suribachi. Every inch of ground was a death trap. Every movement met with a wall of fire. Among those Marines was Sergeant Tony Stein, a soft-spoken machinist from Dayton, Ohio, and a man who refused to accept that standard issue meant good enough. Before the invasion, Stein had secretly transformed an aircraft-mounted and /M 2.30 caliber machine gun, ripped straight from a crashed Navy Dauntless dive bomber, into a shoulder-fired infantry weapon. The military called it illegal. Stein called it necessary. He named it the Stinger, a weapon so fast, so devastating, that spat lead 3 times faster than any Browning rifle on the island. And when the Marines hit the beach, that single act of defiance turned one man into a walking fortress. With his custom-built Stinger blazing, Stein charged bunker after bunker, dragging wounded men to safety, cutting through enemy nests that had pinned down entire squads. And by the time the smoke cleared, Sergeant Tony Stein would etch his name into Marine Corps legend. Not for following orders, but for breaking them. Back-end index pointing right, stay tuned, because this is the untold story of how one illegal invention changed the fate of Iwo Jima. February 1945. The Pacific War had reached its most brutal stage. After 3 years of island hopping, the United States was closing in on Japan's final line of defense. The next target, Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 8 square miles in size, but vital for one reason: its airfields. If captured, American bombers returning from raids over Japan could land safely instead of ditching in the sea. If not, thousands of airmen would continue dying over the Pacific. But the Japanese knew that too. Deep beneath the surface, General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, commander of the island's garrison, had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress of steel and rock. More than 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited in a labyrinth of bunkers, tunnels, and pillboxes carved into the island itself. Their orders were simple: fight to the death. No retreat, no surrender. When the U.S. Marines hit the beaches on February 19th, 1945, they were met not by waves of charging enemies, but by silence, then thunder. From hidden positions, hundreds of machine guns opened fire. Mortars rained down. Tanks burned. By nightfall, more than 2,400 Marines were dead or wounded. Among the chaos stood Sergeant Tony Stein, a 24-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, wiry, calm, and inventive. Before the war, he'd been a toolmaker at a local factory, the kind of man who could build anything from scraps of metal. When the Marines handed him the standard Browning automatic rifle BAR, Stein immediately saw a problem. It jammed too often, overheated too fast, and lacked the firepower needed for the suicidal terrain of Iwo Jima. So, Stein did what no one else dared to do. He broke the rules. While stationed in the Pacific before Iwo Jima, he discovered a wrecked Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Mounted in its wings was a pair of /M 2 aircraft machine guns, the same ones used to rip through enemy planes at over 1,200 rounds per minute, nearly triple the fire rate of a ground bar. Where others saw wreckage, Stein saw salvation. With the precision of a master craftsman, he stripped one of the guns from the plane, modified its trigger system, added a custom stock and sights, and mounted it on a bar bipod. What emerged looked like something out of a nightmare, a hybrid weapon that no manual could explain. It was lighter, faster, and deadlier than anything a Marine had carried before. He called it the Stinger. When Stein showed it to his commanding officer, the reaction was immediate: shock, disbelief, then a warning. "This isn't regulation, Sergeant. You can't take that into combat." But Stein smiled and said, "Sir, if it works, it's regulation enough for me." No one could argue with that logic, not when the invasion was hours away. And so, when a Marine stormed Iwo Jima's black beaches under the shadow of Mount Suribachi, Sergeant Tony Stein carried the only weapon of its kind in existence, a weapon that would make him a legend within 3 days. Because in the fires of Iwo Jima, one man with a handmade machine gun would do what entire squads could not, and prove that ingenuity can be as deadly as any army. February 19th, 1945, 10:30 a.m. The first waves of Marines from the 26th Regiment, 5th Marine Division, were pinned flat against the scorching black sand. The volcanic ash gave no cover, no grip. Every step felt like climbing in quicksand under a storm of bullets. Japanese gunners, hidden in steel-reinforced bunkers, had perfect sight lines on every inch of the beach. Machine gun nests stitched death across the landing zone. Mortar shells burst in ear-splitting concussions. Medics were being cut down, trying to reach the wounded. Entire squads were stranded, pinned, trapped, and slowly being annihilated. And that's when Sergeant Tony Stein stood up. Without hesitation, he slung the Stinger off his shoulder, a weapon no one had seen before in combat, and charged straight toward the Japanese positions. His fellow Marines shouted for him to get down, but Stein didn't listen. He sprinted across open sand, his boots sinking with each step, bullets snapping past his head. Then he opened fire. That night, when the sky glowed red from burning wreckage, Stein sat beside his weapon, cleaning it by moonlight. The others stared at him with quiet awe, the machinist who'd built his own miracle. But Stein knew this was just the beginning. The island had barely begun to reveal its horrors. February 20th, 1945, Iwo Jima. Dawn broke over the volcanic island with a dull red glow. The black sands still smoked from the previous day's shelling, littered with twisted helmets, wrecked landing craft, and the bodies of men who had never made it past the surf. The wind carried the smell of sulfur, oil, and blood, the scent of hell itself. The Marines had survived the night, but the Japanese were far from beaten. From their underground labyrinth, a network of 11 miles of tunnel, Kurabayashi's soldiers launched coordinated counterattacks. They appeared and vanished like ghosts, striking from hidden trapdoors, camouflage bunkers, and pillboxes that had survived naval bombardments. On Red Beach, the 26th Regiment was once again pinned, and in the middle of the chaos, Sergeant Tony Stein was already moving. The Stinger, his illegal, handmade machine gun, was still hot from the previous day's fighting. Stein had cleaned it, re-oiled the barrel, and adjusted its sights by hand. To him, it wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of his own will. When another Marine squad became trapped under fire from a cliffside bunker, Stein didn't wait for orders. He crawled forward through the ash, his uniform already torn and blackened, and began firing short, controlled bursts. The Stinger's roar echoed across the ridge, its tracer rounds slicing through the haze like lightning. The Japanese gunners tried to return fire, but they never stood a chance. Stein's weapon cut through the steel firing slit, silencing them instantly. Then, without hesitation, he waved his men forward and advanced again. That's when things got worse. A hidden cave entrance erupted in muzzle flashes. The Marines dove for cover, except Stein. He sprinted straight toward it, the Stinger blazing from his hip. Witnesses later recalled that it looked like something out of a movie. One man charging a bunker, gun roaring, sparks flying from his helmet as bullets ricocheted around him. He threw a grenade through the opening, waited half a second, then dove aside as the explosion blew debris into the air. When the smoke cleared, silence. Stein had taken the position alone. By midday, he had personally destroyed at least 8 enemy fortifications, rescuing multiple wounded Marines in the process. His commanding officer radioed higher command, reporting, "Sergeant Stein's actions have broken the enemy's defense on Red Beach. Recommend citation for gallantry." But Stein wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about ammo. Again, the Stinger's appetite for bullets was impossible to feed. Once more, he stripped off his gear and made the deadly run back to the beach, bare-chested to move faster, sprinting through machine gun fire like it was rain. Every time he came back, he carried ammunition, and sometimes another Marine slung over his shoulder. By evening, men who'd once laughed at his illegal weapon now looked at it with reverence. The Stinger had saved them again and again. As the sun set behind the island's ridge, Stein sat with his squad, reloading the few remaining magazines. His hands were trembling from exhaustion, his face streaked with ash. But when someone asked how he was still standing, he gave the same quiet grin. Just doing what needs doing. That night, word spread through the 5th Division. There's a guy with a homemade gun clearing bunkers like he's invincible. And by morning, everyone on Iwo Jima knew his name. Sergeant Tony Stein, the one-man army of Red Beach. February 21st, 1945, Iwo Jima, Day 3. The sun rose over a battlefield transformed into a graveyard. Smoke rolled across the black sands, mingling with the mist that hung low over the volcanic ridges. The sound of war never stopped. Machine guns rattled, mortars thumped, and the ground quaked beneath every explosion. The Marines of the 26th Regiment were pushing inland toward the base of Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the island. Capturing it would give them the high ground, but it was also where the Japanese were most deeply entrenched. Kuribayashi's men had fortified the mountain's base with overlapping fields of fire, concrete pillboxes, and camouflage sniper nests. And at the front of it all was Sergeant Tony Stein. For 2 straight days, Stein had done the impossible. He'd charged open terrain, neutralized bunkers, and rescued his wounded comrades again and again. The men who followed him now did so without hesitation. They trusted him, and they trusted that sound, the ripping thunder of the stinger that meant help had arrived. As his platoon advanced through the shattered terrain, they were suddenly hit by withering fire from a ridge bunker that had survived every artillery barrage. Marines dropped to the ground, pinned once again. Stein crawled up to his commanding officer and said calmly, "I'll take it out." He stripped off his gear, even his helmet, to move faster, then took only the stinger and a few grenades. With every muscle burning and his uniform torn to rags, he began another solo charge. Machine gun fire stitched the sand around him. He fell, rolled, and came up firing. The stinger screamed 1,200 rounds a minute, brass casings raining down like golden rain. Stein's fire tore through the gun's slit, silencing the enemy long enough for his men to move. He tossed a grenade, then rushed forward, firing again before the smoke even cleared. By the time the shooting stopped, the bunker was silent. The Marines followed his lead, clearing the rest of the position. But the victory came at a cost. Stein was bleeding. A shrapnel wound along his shoulder. Medics urged him to fall back, but he refused. "Patch me up," he said. "We're not done yet." He went back out again and again, each time carrying ammunition, dragging the wounded to safety, and firing the stinger until its barrel glowed red. By afternoon, he'd made 8 more trips through open fire. On his final trip, as he sprinted toward the beach for more ammunition, a sniper's bullet found him. He fell instantly, the stinger dropping beside him in the black sand. He never got up again. When word reached his company, no one spoke for a long time. The man who'd carried them through hell, who'd fought like a machine and cared for his men like a brother, was gone. That night, Marines quietly gathered the parts of his weapon, cleaned it, and wrapped it in cloth. The stinger would never fire again. But the story of Sergeant Tony Stein, the machinist from Ohio who broke the rules and rewrote heroism, spread across every unit on Iwo Jima. Days later, on February 23rd, as the American flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi, the men who watched thought not only of victory, but of the ones who'd made it possible. One of them whispered, "Stein should have seen this." And though he wasn't there, every Marine on that island knew part of that flag was his. February 23rd, 1945, Iwo Jima. The morning sky glowed with fire and smoke as Marines of the 5th Division fought their way up Mount Suribachi. Every inch was paid for in blood. Then, in a moment burned into history, a small group of Marines raised the American flag atop the mountain, a sight that sent cheers through the ranks below and tears through battle-hardened eyes. But for the men of Red Beach, that victory carried a hollow silence, because Sergeant Tony Stein wasn't there to see it. Just 2 days before the flag was raised, he'd fallen during his 8th run across the open sands, struck down while bringing ammunition to his brothers in arms. The Marines who had served beside him, the ones who'd seen him charge bunkers alone, who'd heard the furious roar of his Stinger tearing through the enemy, knew they had lost more than a soldier. They had lost a force of nature. Back at the front lines, word spread fast. Marines whispered his name like a legend, Stein, the guy with the homemade gun. They talked about the machinist who could have stayed behind in a workshop, but chose to fight with the weapon he built himself. His story reached command tents, ships offshore, and eventually the American mainland. In his absence, the Stinger lived on. Other Marines, inspired by Stein's ingenuity, began to salvage their own and M2 aircraft guns from wrecked planes. With help from armorers, they converted 6 more of these high-speed machine guns into infantry weapons. Each was called a Stinger, in honor of the man who had proven its worth under fire. Those makeshift weapons went on to be used in the closing stages of the Pacific War, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Though crude in design, they were devastating in combat. And every time one of those guns roared, it carried Stein's legacy with it, a weapon born from defiance and courage. In the months that followed, reports of his heroism reached Washington. Officers who had witnessed his actions filed detailed accounts describing how Stein had single-handedly cleared multiple enemy positions and saved numerous lives. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after the invasion of Iwo Jima, the United States Marine Corps posthumously awarded Sergeant Tony Stein the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Sergeant Stein's superb initiative, outstanding skill, and indomitable courage were in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service." His medal was presented to his widow, Joan Stein, in their hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She stood silent as the citation was read, her husband's name echoing in a hall filled with Marines and veterans who had served beside him. That day, Tony Stein was no longer just a soldier. He became a symbol of ingenuity, bravery, and the unbreakable human spirit that defines those who fight not for orders, but for each other. And yet, those who survived Iwo Jima said something far greater than medals or ceremonies ever could. If you were pinned down and heard the Stinger, you knew you'd live another day. The Stinger's roar may have fallen silent, but its echo still lingers in the hearts of every Marine who walked those black sands. August 1945, the Pacific War ends. After years of brutal combat, mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and silence fell across the islands that had once echoed with gunfire. But for the Marines who fought at Iwo Jima, peace felt heavy, like the calm after a storm that had taken too much. Among those who survived, the name Tony Stein was spoken with reverence. They remembered the wiry machinist from Ohio, the man who built his own destiny, defied the manual, and fought with a weapon the military had called impossible. He had become something larger than life, a reminder of how courage and creativity could turn the tide of history. When the surviving Marines returned home, they carried Stein's story with them. In bars, on bases, and in workshops, they told the tale of the Stinger, a machine gun that should never have existed, and the sergeant who made it roar. Some even recreated his design, sketching from memory, trying to honor the ingenuity that had saved their lives on the beaches of Iwo Jima. Historians later confirmed that only 7 Stingers were ever built, 6 after Stein's original. None survived the war intact, but their legacy lived in the evolution of Marine Corps weaponry, the demand for lighter, faster, higher rate of fire guns that could keep up with the chaos of modern combat. In a quiet, unspoken way, Stein's illegal invention helped shape the very weapons carried by future generations of Marines. In Dayton, Ohio, his name was etched into stone, Sergeant Tony Stein, Medal of Honor, Iwo Jima, 1945. Each Memorial Day, veterans and families would leave flowers by his plaque, and those who knew his story would always say the same thing. He was the kind of Marine who made others brave. His comrades never forgot the sound of the Stinger, the tearing thunder that told them someone was still fighting. To them, it wasn't just a weapon. It was hope, forged from scrap, carried by will, and fired by a man who refused to die quietly. Somber pause, cinematic tone softens. As the years passed, the world moved on. But in Marine Corps training halls, young recruits still heard about Iwo Jima, about the mountain, the flag, and the men who wouldn't quit. And among those names, whispered like a legend, was always his, Tony Stein, the machinist who turned defiance into victory. Because in every generation, there are those who look at the impossible and build their own answer. This was the story of Sergeant Tony Stein, the Marine who broke the rules, built his own weapon, and changed the fate of men on Iwo Jima forever. If you believe stories like Tony Stein's should never be forgotten, make sure to follow, share, and keep these voices alive. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's remembered by those who dare to fight differently.